Imagine going blind in one eye for 7 months, telling a room full of doctors something is deeply wrong with your body, and being sent away with a shrug because you don't fit the picture they have in their heads. Now imagine that happening not once, but again and again for almost 20 years, while the whole country watches you on television every afternoon, believing you are the picture of strength. That is the story hiding underneath the smile of Montel Williams, a man the world knew as a decorated naval officer and a beloved talk show host long before it knew he was fighting a war inside his own nervous system. Montel Williams was born on July 3, 1956, in Baltimore, Maryland, the youngest of 4 children in a household built on structure and expectation. His father, Herman Williams, worked his way up through the Baltimore Fire Department and would eventually become the city's first black fire chief, a man whose authority at home was absolute and whose approval was never handed out lightly. His mother, Marjorie, balanced that intensity with a quieter, steadier kind of love, the kind that held the family together when discipline alone left something missing. Growing up in that house taught young Montel a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. Nothing worth having comes without effort, and excellence is not a bonus. It is the baseline. At Andover High School, Montel was elected class president 2 years running, excelled academically, and stayed active in sports and music. But the real test of everything his parents had instilled in him was still ahead. As a black teenager coming of age in the 1970s, he was also learning early that he would often have to work twice as hard just to be given the same consideration as his peers, a lesson that would repeat itself throughout his adult life in ways he could not yet predict. After graduating in 1974, he enlisted in the Marine Corps and earned a spot at the Naval Academy Preparatory School, a rare and difficult path into one of the most demanding institutions in the country. A year later, he was accepted into the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, becoming the first black student to complete both the prep school and the academy itself, a distinction that carried real weight inside an institution still working through what full inclusion actually looked like in practice. It was there, during his time at Annapolis, that the very first warning sign of what would later upend his life quietly appeared, and almost nobody, including Montel, understood what it meant. In 1980, while still a midshipman, Montel lost vision in his left eye for roughly 7 months. At the time, multiple sclerosis was widely and wrongly thought of as a disease that mainly affected white women, so the possibility was barely considered for a young black man built like an athlete. Doctors examined him, found nothing definitive, and sent him on his way. He graduated that same year with a degree in general engineering, a minor in international security affairs, and training in Chinese language study, stepping into a Navy career that would eventually make him a cryptologist and an intelligence officer. He served aboard the USS Sampson during the American operation in Grenada, earned an Armed Forces Expeditionary Medal, along with several commendation and service medals, and would go on to serve a combined 22 years across the Marine Corps and Navy before retiring as a lieutenant commander. It was a career built on precision and secrecy, the kind of work that demanded he read situations quickly and trust his training completely, skills that would later resurface in an entirely different arena. On paper, it was a textbook military career, filled with the kind of discipline that turns young recruits into officers other people look to for calm under pressure. Underneath it, though, his body kept sending signals nobody was reading correctly, and he had no way yet to know that the very instincts that made him a strong officer, push through, don't complain, keep functioning, were quietly working against him. Throughout the 1980s, strange symptoms would surface and vanish again: numbness, unexplained pain, moments of physical weakness that made no obvious sense. Doctors offered him theories that ranged from stress to being overweight, and Montel, trained since childhood to push through discomfort without complaint, did exactly that. He internalized the pain as something to manage privately rather than a signal that something specific and serious was happening inside him. It is a pattern many people living with chronic and hard-to-diagnose conditions know all too well. Being told, over and over, that what you are feeling either isn't real or isn't worth investigating further. By the late 1980s, Montel had left the military and started building a second life as a motivational speaker, drawing on the discipline and command presence the Navy had shaped in him. He traveled the country speaking to young people about substance abuse and personal responsibility, and it was that same commanding, sincere delivery, more sermon than sales pitch, that eventually caught the attention of television producers. In 1991, that path led him somewhere few would have predicted, into daytime television as the host of his own nationally syndicated program, The Montel Williams Show. He became the first black man to host a nationally syndicated daytime talk show, and instead of following the era's growing appetite for confrontation and spectacle, he built a show around listening. Guests spoke about addiction, family estrangement, military struggles, and social issues that other programs treated as punchlines, and Montel treated them as people, often steering conversations back toward dignity, even when the subject matter was raw. That approach earned him a Daytime Emmy Award for Outstanding Talk Show Host in 1996 and helped carry the show through an extraordinary 17-year run, airing more than 4,000 episodes and reaching millions of households before it finally came to a close in 2008. Behind the cameras, Montel's personal life was its own kind of demanding. He married 3 times over the course of his career. His first marriage to Rochelle C. began in 1982 and produced 2 daughters, Ashley and Marissa, before ending in 1989. His second marriage, to Grace Morley, began in 1992 and gave him a son, Montel Jr., and a daughter, Wintergress, before the couple divorced in 2000, the very year his health crisis became public knowledge. In 2007, he married Tara Fowler, a relationship that has lasted to the most physically demanding chapter of his life. Balancing a punishing production schedule, a growing public platform, and a family life that needed real presence rather than headlines was never simple, and Montel has been candid over the years at the pace of his career, asked a great deal of the people closest to him. All the while, the mystery inside his body kept deepening. The vision lost from his academy years, the unexplained numbness, the pain that came and went without warning. These were not separate problems. They were pieces of a single pattern that no one had connected yet. It would take almost 2 full decades from that first episode of blindness in 1980 before Montel finally received an answer. In August of 1999, at 43 years old, doctors diagnosed him with relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis, a disease in which the body's own immune system attacks a protective coating around nerve fibers, disrupting the signals between brain and body in ways that can affect vision, sensation, balance, and mobility. Rather than retreat from public life, Montel chose transparency almost immediately, going public with his diagnosis that same year. For a man raised to treat vulnerability as something to manage quietly, standing in front of cameras and admitting he was living with an unpredictable, incurable neurological condition was its own act of courage, separate from anything he had done in uniform or on a soundstage. He later reflected that part of why his diagnosis took so long to reach him was tied to outdated assumptions about who gets multiple sclerosis, noting his own family history, including a maternal grandmother from Scotland, as a piece of the puzzle doctors had overlooked for years because he did not fit their expectations. In 2002, Montel turned that long and frustrating journey into a mission, founding the Montel Williams MS Foundation to fund research and support people navigating the same uncertainty he once faced alone. He used the platform his television career had given him to push multiple sclerosis into the national conversation, testifying before Congress on veterans' health issues and advocating for better understanding of a disease that, because its symptoms are so often invisible to outside observers, can leave patients feeling isolated even when surrounded by people who care about them. His military background gave his advocacy a particular credibility. This was not a celebrity dabbling in a cause, but a decorated officer speaking from first-hand experience about pain that does not show up on the outside. The foundation's work stretched beyond fundraising for research. It also focused on reaching communities that traditionally had less access to specialists and treatment, an effort shaped directly by Montel's own experience of being overlooked for years because he did not fit the profile doctors expected. He spoke at hospitals, community centers, and veterans organizations, often pairing his story with a broader message about listening to patients rather than dismissing symptoms that don't match a textbook case. That same instinct for advocacy carried into his work on behalf of fellow veterans. Long after leaving active service, Montel remained a visible voice on issues affecting service members, using congressional testimony and public appearances to push for improvements in veterans' health care and disability support. He often framed his MS advocacy and his veterans' advocacy as 2 sides of the same coin. Both were about refusing to let people suffer quietly simply because their pain wasn't visible to the outside world. It was a natural extension of everything his upbringing and his military training had taught him. Discipline is not just about enduring hardship yourself. It's about making sure the system treats the next person's hardship seriously, too. Living with MS reshaped nearly every part of Montel's daily routine. He has spoken openly about neurological pain so intense it felt like walking on hot coals, about fatigue that sleep alone could never fix, and about the discipline it takes to manage a body that no longer responds predictably to effort or willpower. Over time, he overhauled his diet, paying closer attention to sugar, salt, and processed food, and made daily exercise a non-negotiable part of managing his symptoms rather than an optional extra, treating his own body less like a machine to push and more like a system to carefully maintain. He also became a vocal advocate for medical cannabis as part of his pain management approach, citing his own experience with chronic MS-related pain and eventually starting a cannabis-focused company built around that advocacy, arguing publicly that patients deserve more options than the ones traditional pain management alone could offer. None of it erased the disease, but all of it reflected the same mindset that carried him through Annapolis decades earlier. You don't get to choose a fight, but you do get to choose how you show up for it, one small daily decision at a time. What makes Montel's story land differently from a typical inspirational headline is how honest he has remained about the limits of that mindset. He has acknowledged that the demands of fame and a health crisis together took a toll on his relationships, that presence is not the same thing as good intentions, and that the people closest to him sometimes paid a price for a schedule and a spotlight he could not always control. That kind of honesty from a man whose entire public identity was built on projecting strength adds a layer of humanity that pure triumph narratives tend to leave out. Real resilience, in his telling, was never about never breaking. It was about what you do afterward. More recently, in interviews and podcast appearances, Montel has revisited the full arc of his diagnostic journey, the blindness of the Naval Academy, the 2 decades of dismissed symptoms, the eventual diagnosis, and where his health stands today. He has described living with a now more stable form of the disease, and has been clear that he refuses to let multiple sclerosis become the defining fact of who he is. Instead, he frames the disease as one chapter in a much longer story about persistence, one that includes his military service, his years reshaping daytime television, his role as a father across 3 marriages, and his ongoing advocacy for both veterans and people living with chronic illness. There is something worth sitting with in the shape of his story. A young man in uniform loses sight in one eye and is told it's nothing. A rising television star spends years in quiet pain while cameras capture only his composure. A public figure finally gets an answer after 2 decades of being overlooked, in part because he didn't match a stereotype about who gets sick. And instead of retreating into privacy once he finally understood what he was facing, he turned his diagnosis into one of the more visible advocacy campaigns of his era, using the same discipline that got him to the Naval Academy to build something lasting for people who might otherwise have gone unheard the way he once was. Montel Williams' life resists the easy version of the story, the one where the hero simply overcomes and the credits roll. His reality is messy and, in some ways, more useful than that. Marriages that didn't survive the pressure, a body that still negotiates with him every single day, a bank account and a lifestyle that both looked different than they did at his career's peak, and a legacy that was never really about ratings or rank to begin with. What remains constant across all of it is a refusal to let any single chapter, not the Navy, not the talk show, not the diagnosis, stand in for the whole of who he is. He has spent more than 2 decades showing in public what it looks like to keep functioning, keep advocating, and keep showing up for other people while carrying something that never fully lets go. If there's a single thread running through the discipline of his childhood home, the demands of Annapolis, the intimacy he brought to daytime television, and the advocacy he has built around multiple sclerosis, it is this. Strength was never about avoiding hardship. It was about what you choose to build once hardship becomes permanent. Montel Williams didn't get to pick the mountain in front of him. He simply decided, again and again, not to let it decide who he was. If a story moved you, consider leaving a like as a small tribute to that persistence, and subscribe for more stories about people who keep going even when the odds, and sometimes their own bodies, tell them not to.